Ever feel like you're trying to, I don't know, decipher a secret code when you read about the economy?
Uh-huh. Yeah, we can definitely feel that way.
There's this whole underlying structure, right? It shapes everything from like the price of your coffee to your job prospects. Today, we're trying to crack that code.
Exactly. Think of this as a journey to understand the basic DNA of our economic system.
Okay.
We're doing a deep dive into economic institutions. These are really the fundamental building blocks, the foundation for how we produce things, buy things, sell things,
Yeah.
how the whole system works.
And our mission today, using chapter 3 of an economics textbook as our guide, is to really pull out the key ideas for you. We'll look at different ways economies are set up,
Mm-hmm.
who the main players are in a market economy like the U.S., and crucially, the role government plays, both here at home and, globally.
Right. And just so you know what's coming up, we'll be defining different systems, comparing them a bit, looking at the specific roles of businesses and households, and even digging into some numbers on government income and spending just to see the scale of it all.
Okay, so economic institutions, we keep saying that phrase, what exactly are they, and why should we care?
Well, imagine trying to play football without any rules.
Chaos. Complete chaos.
Right. Economic institutions are kind of like that. They're the formal rules, and sometimes even the informal ones, that give structure to everything we do economically. They set the boundaries, you could say.
Okay, boundaries. Can you give us some concrete examples? Like, what does that look like in the real world?
Sure. Think about laws protecting private property. That's a big one.
Okay, like owning your house or your car.
Exactly. The legal system recognizes and, importantly, enforces that ownership. That's a formal institution. Then you have the legal system itself, the courts, police, they uphold those laws.
Makes sense.
Political systems are institutions too, how we make collective choices. And even less formal things like the cultural expectation that you'll honor a contract you make. That's an informal rule, but it has a huge economic impact.
So different sets of these rules and norms lead to different kinds of economic systems then.
Precisely.
Let's start with the market economy. That's the one usually associated with the U.S., right?
Yes, exactly. At its core, a market economy is really built on two main pillars: private property and free markets.
Okay.
So individuals, at least in theory, have a lot of freedom to decide, what gets made, how it gets made, and who it's made for.
And how does that work? What drives those decisions?
It's really driven by rewards and payments, incentives. People respond to the chance to earn money or make a profit. And within the legal limits set by those institutions we just talked about, there's quite a bit of freedom to pursue those economic goals. And yeah, the U.S. is definitely seen as a prime example of a market economy.
Now, we often hear the term capitalism used almost interchangeably with market economy, especially for the U.S. Are they the same thing, or is there a difference?
That's a great question. They're closely related, but not quite identical. Capitalism is, let's say, a specific type of market economy. The key thing that distinguishes capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production.
Means of production, like factories, machinery.
Exactly. Factories, large tools, major infrastructure used for production. In a capitalist system, these are mostly owned by a relatively small group of people or entities, often called capitalists.
Got it. So both rely on private property, but capitalism specifically emphasizes who owns the big production resources.
You've got it.
Okay, so that's the market capitalist side. What about the alternative we hear about, socialism? How does that compare?
Socialism presents a fundamentally different approach. The ideal, the sort of textbook definition, is a system based more on cooperation and goodwill.
Goodwill, not self-interest.
Well, less emphasis on individual self-interest as the primary driver. The core idea is that society as a whole should decide the big economic questions: what to produce, how, and for whom.
So the for whom isn't just about who can afford it, but maybe who needs it.
Precisely. The principle often cited for theoretical socialism is from each according to his ability to each according to his need.
Right.
The idea is you contribute what you can, and you receive based on your needs, with decisions supposedly made in the best interest of society overall. Now, you often hear countries like China or Venezuela mentioned as socialist in the news,
Yeah.
though the actual way their economies work is, well, pretty complex and often debated. It's not always a neat fit with the theory.
And how does that usually play out in practice? How does a socialist economy actually function day to day?
Well, historically, and in many systems described as socialist, you see significant government ownership of those means of production we talked about.
Okay, so the government owns the factories not private individuals.
Often, yes. And this frequently goes along with central planning. Government boards or agencies set economic goals, targets for production and direct resources, sometimes called a command economy.
It feels like, though, economists today maybe focus less on these big labels like capitalism versus socialism.
That's a really sharp observation. Yeah, modern economics often shifts the focus. Instead of just slapping a label on a country, analysts look more closely at the specific institutions in place.
Back to the institutions.
Exactly. Small differences in, say, how property rights are enforced, or how contracts work, or the specific regulations, these can actually have a bigger impact on how an economy performs than just calling it capitalist or socialist. The details matter.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So let's focus back on the U.S. market economy then. Who are the key players interacting within this system?
Okay. We can think about it using a model called the circular flow. It shows how everything connects. The main players are businesses, households, and the government.
Right.
And increasingly, we absolutely have to include international connections in that picture, too.
Let's start with businesses. What's their basic role in this flow?
Businesses are essentially the private units doing the producing. They make the goods and services. Their big decisions are what to make, how much, and who to sell it to. And the main goal, typically, is to make a profit. But, and this is a key concept, businesses in a market system are largely guided by something called consumer sovereignty.
Consumer sovereignty. Sounds powerful. What does that mean?
It means that, ultimately, the consumers have the final say through their buying choices.
How so?
Well, if people don't want to buy what a business is selling, that business probably won't succeed long term, right?
Sure.
So by choosing where you spend your dollars, you, the consumer, are essentially sending signals to businesses about what they should be producing.
So we vote with our wallets, basically.
That's a great way to put it. Now, to actually make those things consumers want, businesses need inputs, resources.
Like what?
Things like machinery, that's capital, workers' labor,
Wow.
raw materials, the ideas and risk-taking of entrepreneurs, land, all those things needed for production.
Okay.
And the place where businesses get these inputs, that's called the factor market.
So the job market is part of the factor market where they get labor.
Exactly.
Got it. And how are these businesses typically structured? Legally, I mean.
Good question. There are three main forms you see most often: sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations.
Okay, let's take them one by one. Sole proprietorships.
Right. These are actually the most common by sheer number, something like 72% of all businesses. It's simple. One owner,
Advantages.
minimal hassle to set up usually, and the owner has direct control. Easy decisions.
Disadvantages.
Big ones, potentially. Often hard to raise large amounts of money. And the owner faces unlimited personal liability. Meaning if the business gets into debt, the owner's personal assets, house, car, savings could be at risk to pay it off. It's all tied together.
Oof. Yeah, that's a big risk. What about partnerships?
Partnerships involve two or more owners who agree to share in the business. They make up about 10% of businesses.
And the pros and cons there?
Well, pros include sharing the work, sharing the risk, maybe pooling more resources than one person could. Also, relatively easy to form. But the big disadvantage is still often unlimited personal liability for the partners. And get this, you could potentially be liable for your partner's mistakes, too.
Wow. Okay. So choose your partners wisely.
Definitely. Then you have corporations.
The big ones we usually think of.
Often, yes, though they can be small, too. Corporations are only about 18% of businesses by number, but they bring in something like 81% of all business revenue, so huge impact.
What makes them different?
The key is that a corporation is legally treated as a separate person distinct from its owners, who are the stockholders.
Okay. And why does that matter?
The biggest advantage is limited liability.
So the owner's personal assets are protected if the company goes bust.
Generally, yes. Their risk is usually limited to the value of their stock. Corporations also find it easier to raise money by selling stock or bonds, and there can be some tax advantages sometimes.
Downsides.
More legal hassle to set up and maintain. There's the issue of double taxation. Profits might be taxed at the corporate level, and again when paid out to shareholders as dividends. And there could be monitoring problems, making sure the managers hired to run the company are actually acting in the best interests of the owners, the stockholders.
Interesting. The source also mentions things like B Corp, L3Cs.
Yeah, those are newer forms. Flexible purpose corporations, or B Corp and L3Cs. They're businesses that try to blend profit-making with specific social or environmental goals. It's an evolving area.
Okay, so businesses are producing things, responding to consumers. Let's flip to the other side.
Mhm.
Households, what's their role?
Households, basically groups of people making joint decisions, usually living together, play two really critical roles.
Okay, what are they?
First, they are the main suppliers of labor. It's people from households who work in businesses and for the government.
Right, we all need jobs.
Exactly. Their work drives production. Second, through their spending, they're the ones exerting that consumer sovereignty we talked about.
Voting with their dollars.
Yep. Their collective spend decisions tell businesses what to make. So they're fundamental on both the supply side, labor, and the demand side spending.
Do we have a sense of the scale, like the U.S. labor force?
Yeah, the source had some 2018 data. The total labor force was around 162 million people back then. Unemployment was just under 4%.
Yep.
Average work week was about 41 hours for men, 36 for women. Median weekly pay, $959 for men, $780 for women. And the average hourly wage was around $25.
Interesting gender gap there, even in the averages.
Yes, that's often highlighted. And one more point. The source notes that while households collectively are arguably the most powerful economic institution because of that spending and labor power,
Yeah.
over time, they've effectively delegated a lot of that power to both government and businesses.
That's a fascinating point. And it brings us right to the third player, government. What are the main ways government gets involved in a market economy like ours?
Government wears basically two big hats in the economy.
Two hats.
First, it's an actor itself. It collects money, mostly through taxes, and then it spends that money.
Like buying things, providing services.
Exactly. Buying military equipment, building roads, paying teachers, funding research, social security payments. Lots of things. That's the government as an actor.
And the second hat.
The second hat is the government as referee, setting the rules of the game.
Ah, like the institutions we started with.
Precisely. It establishes and enforces the laws and regulations that govern how businesses and households interact with each other.
Okay, let's break down the actor role first. You mentioned taxes and spending. How big is the government's economic footprint?
It's substantial.
Right.
In the U.S., we have a federal system, right? Federal government, state governments, and local governments.
Right. 3 levels.
All those levels combined consume about 18% of the country's total output, and they employ around 22 million people.
Wow, 22 million.
Yeah, it's a lot. And interestingly, state and local governments actually employ the majority of those, over 19 million people. Their combined spending is huge, too, around $3 trillion a year.
Where do state and local governments get all that money? Is it mostly property taxes?
Property taxes are significant, about 16%, but not the biggest piece. The largest chunk, around 21%, actually comes from the federal government intergovernmental transfers.
Okay.
Then you have sales taxes at about 18%. Charges for services like water bills or university tuition make up 14%. Income taxes are about 12%. Utilities they run provide 7%, other taxes 5%, and various other sources the last 7%. It's quite a mix.
And what do they spend it on? Education must be big.
It is. Education is the single largest category for state and local spending at about 31%. Health and welfare programs are also massive at 30%.
Wow, those two are almost 2/3 combined.
Yeah. Then you have utilities at 10%, public safety police, fire at 9%, transportation roads, bridges at 7%, administration 6%, parks and recreation 2%, and other things make up the rest.
Okay, so that's state and local. How does the federal government's budget look different? Where does this money come from?
The federal government relies heavily on individual income taxes. That's about 45% of its revenue.
Almost half.
Yeah. Then Social Security and Medicare taxes, payroll taxes are another big chunk, about 36%. Corporate income taxes bring in around 11%, and the rest, about 8%, comes from excise taxes, like on gasoline or alcohol and other sources.
And where does the federal money go? Defense.
Defense is significant, about 14% of spending, according to this source. But the largest categories are actually income security programs, things like Social Security, unemployment benefits, food assistance, that's about 33%,
Okay.
and health and education combined make up another 32%. That includes Medicare, Medicaid, funding for research, education grants, and so on.
So income support and health education are the biggest federal spending areas.
By far. Interest payments on the national debt are also substantial, around 11%.
Yeah.
And then various other functions make up the remaining 10%.
So that covers government as an actor, a huge buyer and spender. What about its role as the referee, setting the rules?
Right. This is where the government shapes the playing field for everyone else. It sets the legal framework. Think about laws against discrimination in hiring equal opportunity laws. Labor laws setting minimum wage, overtime rules, workplace safety standards.
OSHA regulations, things like that.
Exactly. Antitrust laws preventing businesses from fixing prices or forming monopolies that harm competition. Rules about union membership in some jobs. It's a vast web of regulations.
It really is. The source also laid out 6 specific roles for government in a market economy. Can we quickly recap those? Seems important.
Yeah, absolutely. These kind of summarize why the government gets involved. First, providing that stable set of institutions and rules we keep coming back to. The basic foundation.
Okay, rule of law.
Second, promoting effective and workable competition, trying to keep markets fair.
Right, antitrust.
Third, correcting for externalities.
Externalities, like pollution.
Pollution is the classic example. A cost imposed on others not involved in the transaction. Government might tax pollution or regulate it.
Got it.
Fourth, ensuring economic stability and growth. Think of the Federal Reserve managing interest rates or government spending to fight a recession. Macroeconomic stuff.
Okay.
Fifth, providing public goods. Things that the private market likely wouldn't provide efficiently, if at all.
Like national defense, lighthouses.
National defense, yes. Basic research, maybe some infrastructure. Goods that are hard to charge for individually and benefit everyone.
Makes sense. And the 6th role.
Sixth, adjusting for undesirable market results. This is where things like addressing extreme income inequality or poverty might come in, or setting minimum safety standards for products, intervening when the market outcome is seen as unfair or harmful.
So the market doesn't always get it right, and that's where government might step in. But the source also mentioned market failures and government failures. What's that about?
Right. It's not always simple. A market failure is a situation where the market, left alone, doesn't lead to an efficient or desirable outcome. We just listed reasons why that might happen: externalities, monopolies, lack of public goods. But then there's government failure. That's when government intervention, maybe intended to fix a market failure, actually makes things worse.
How could that happen?
Oh, lots of ways. Maybe the regulation is poorly designed, creates unintended consequences. Maybe it's inefficient. Maybe political goals interfere with good policy.
So it's a balancing act, deciding which potential failure is worse.
Exactly. Policymakers constantly have to weigh whether the problems caused by market failure are worse than the potential problems caused by government intervention. It's often a tough judgment call.
Okay, one last big piece, the global context. How does the U.S. economy connect with the rest of the world?
Hugely important. The U.S. economy isn't an island. It's deeply integrated globally. We account for, about 15% of the entire world's output and consumption?
Wow, 15%?
Yeah, even though we have a much smaller percentage of the world's population or land area. And think about global corporations, companies with major operations in many countries.
Right, they're everywhere.
They play a big role in trade, investment, creating jobs, sometimes displacing them too, spreading technology, and increasing competition for domestic firms.
But if these corporations operate globally, who sets the rules for them? Is there a world government referee?
That's the tricky part. No, there isn't a single global government with the power to tax or regulate these multinational corporations in the same way a national government can within its borders.
So how does it work?
Instead, we have a collection of international institutions. These are organizations where countries try to negotiate, coordinate, and set some rules for global commerce and finance.
Could you give some examples?
Sure. You have the United Nations, which aims for broad international cooperation, but it doesn't have much direct economic enforcement power.
Yeah.
There's the World Bank, which primarily provides loans and assistance to developing countries for projects. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, focuses more on monetary issues, exchange rates, financial stability, helping countries in economic crisis.
Right, the IMF often comes up in debt crises.
Exactly. Then you have groups like the G7, the group of 7 major industrialized nations, including the US, Japan, Germany, etc. They meet to discuss and coordinate economic policy among themselves.
More informal coordination.
Somewhat, yes. And finally, there are specific trade agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act, which is now the USMCA, aimed at reducing trade barriers between the US, Mexico, and Canada. These agreements create specific rules for trade among member countries.
So it's a patchwork of different organizations and agreements, not one single global authority.
That's a good way to put it, a complex patchwork.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground here, from the basic rules institutions to the different systems,
Yeah.
the key players like businesses and households in the U.S.,
The roles, their structures.
and then the very complex role of government, both as an actor and a referee, plus all these global connections.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway is how economic activity isn't just random. It's shaped by these formal and informal rules, these institutions. We saw the core ideas behind market economies versus socialist ideals. The
Right.
specifics of how businesses operate, how households participate, and just how involved government is at all levels, federal, state, local, and even internationally through these global bodies.
It really drives home that even though we call the U.S. a market economy, it's far from a free-for-all. It operates within this intricate web of rules and regulations and the actions of all these different players.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic system, always balancing individual freedom, business goals, societal objectives, and government action. It's complex.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on based on all this.
Yeah, how about this? We talked about those 6 specific roles of government in a market economy, providing rules, promoting competition, correcting externalities, ensuring stability, providing public goods, and adjusting for undesirable outcomes.
Right.
Reflect on those 6 roles. Which one do you think is the most critical, the most essential for making a market economy function well and maybe fairly? Something to ponder.